starting off on kind of a philosophical approach, we've had all of us, some more recently than others, have had a chance to read through the veterinarian's oath. And there's a comment on here about using scientific knowledge. And I think that's what this meeting is about. And by your presence here, I assume you have that interest as I do. And that scientific knowledge goes past simply talking about protecting animal health and welfare, but certainly in the times of trying to feed a lot of people and taking care of all of our resources, this conservation of animal resources and advancement of medical knowledge overall is an important facet that we like to think we're involving in our work. As we went through this process with circovirus, there were a series of questions, I guess I could say, that went through our mind, the team, the people who are working on this, and I'll be the first to admit that some of these questions have been answered, and some of these questions are still laying out there to be answered. In these questions, the first was the thought of an infection chain, and the question that came with that was, how does the infection chain, the idea of a series of events happening, how does that affect circovirus within our production herds, affecting both clinically and subclinically? And if we could control that, what expectations would we have? Another question that came along was the vertical transmission of circovirus. Dr. Murtaugh gave a good presentation in regard to circovirus viremic sows creating viremic pigs. The question that we're still pondering is, does that matter? I mean, we know it happens. We did work also that shows that it happens, but the question remains, does it matter? And then finally, if it matters, what tools do we have that we can help to determine the status of these viremic sows versus the occasional sows that are truly not viremic? And finally, are there ways we can intervene? Can we make an impact on circovirus too? How do we measure? Is it successful? So those are, like I say, those are questions that we pondered as we went through the circovirus in relationship to sow herds. And again, some questions are answered and some are still laying out there. As we went through this process, looking for answers, we tried to maintain a level of credibility using an evidence-based medicine. And again, referring back to a couple of our previous speakers, the level of evidence that's readily research available evidence for circovirus is small compared to PRRS virus. But we used what we had available. As we went through our sow herds, we tried to look at populations or groups of sows or pods or flows of sows that made sense from a number standpoint, so that the observations we made would have statistical basis. And finally, we ended up in this third section down here, which was I can't find it in research. We're going to use the numbers we have available. And what does our personal experience tell us? What does our experience with other practitioners tell us? So putting all that together in the bigger picture of sow viremia and circovirus, we came to some decision-making observations, and that's what we'll get to sharing here. One thing I do want to share with the crowd is, to make sure we're all on the same page, is a couple examples of the way pigs flow. We're talking about infection chain, and I think it's important that we understand the production chain also. In the sow herds and pig production that we're going to be talking about this afternoon, we've got a typical internal nucleus sow farm. We're producing weaned pigs. These weaned pigs, the potentially replacement gilts are going into a number of weaned to finished barns. These barns are geographically separated, and they are filled on an all-in, all-out basis. As these gilts mature, as they become selection age gilts, they've got one of two directions that they can flow. We can either drop about half of those gilts into a gilt developer farm, where those gilts are grown for another month, they're bred, and they're actually held in this barn for the first half of gestation. It isn't until they are 6 to 8 weeks bred that they are moved into this pod of 6 fairly uniform sow farms for a total of about 20,000 sows. So we've got select gilts going into a true breeder, a fairly uniform breeder farm, going to sow farms, which are under common management, fairly uniform as a group, and then into nurseries and traditional finishers. The other half of the select gilts that we've been producing that we looked at through this whole circovirus issue, the other half of the select gilts that we produced each week were fed into what we'll call for lack of a better term, a conglomeration of 16 assorted size sow farms, averaging about 700 sows, but definitely a loose conglomeration of sows in that they had different management styles, different production characteristics. The only thing they had in common was they all got gilts out of the same source. And then on a weekly basis, we gathered pigs from we gathered pigs either weekly or monthly, depending on whether these were in a batch farrowing or traditional farrowing system. And these pigs are then flowed into traditional nurseries and finishers. So we'll call the more uniform system or the more heterogeneous system. So the infection chain. What got us started on circovirus as the disease of issue? We had all been through circovirus in finishers, the 2006 version where you see significant mortality in 100 and 150 pound pigs. And we were vaccinating our herds and things were going well at 150 pounds on up. Our concern arose when we had nursery pigs. These are pigs that were 8 to 9 weeks of age, young to mid-nursery age pigs, where 1% of those pigs were showing clinical circovirus PCV2 lesions. We had swollen lymph nodes, we had loss of condition, we had mortality. And again, these were 8-week-old pigs. These were not the typical 150-pound wasting circovirus pigs. So based on the time frame that these pigs are showing up, we began thinking along the lines of an infection chain. Those pigs that are starting to fail at 8 or 9 weeks of age are probably being influenced by an effect either in the farrowing barn or in the mature sow herd, or potentially even these nursery pigs that are giving us issues at such a young age might even be related to something going on in gilt development. So we started down the path of where within this infection chain is the event or events occurring that lead to these young nursery pigs showing circovirus-related diseases. In looking through the research, we could see that if we wanted to look at neonatal pigs and determine is this pig viremic or not, we could gather pig hearts, we could gather fetal hearts, and we could determine if these were viremic pigs. We could gather pre-suckle serum. We could determine viremia and level of viremia, as Dr. Murtaugh discussed, by looking at pre-suckle serum. The problem we had was in trying to get large numbers of samples, we couldn't find any volunteers, me included, who would sit behind sows day after day and night after night waiting for a sow to farrow so he can catch that pig before he gets his first good meal of colostrum. With a little bit of anatomy, we got to thinking about the placental cord that's left laying behind that sow after she farrows. And what we came up with was this placental umbilical cord serum collection, which I'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. Just keep in mind what this is it's a collection of umbilical cord serum as a substitute for pre-suckle serum because it is so much more readily available. The other things we could do as far as monitoring sow herds to determine stability or instability. Again, still trying to get to the end, still trying to understand the situation where we have 8 and 9 week old nursery pigs with circovirus disease. In order to understand sow herd stability, where these pigs are coming from, we looked at the sows themselves. We did oral fluid testing. We also did some serum testing on these sows, and we also did environmental testing. We did Swiffer wiping and testing of the Swiffer fluid from farrowing crates. Again, these were all of these analytical methods were looked at trying to determine where within the infection chain the condition in those little pigs was occurring. To go into a little bit of detail on the umbilical cord collection, this was, if we look at the disadvantage to gathering pre-suckle serum, it's obviously being there at the time that sow is farrowing and then trying to gather enough serum samples. What we found was that we could have the caretaker in the farrowing house gather umbilical cords, gather whole placentas for us as they were expelled from the sow. And these could be gathered immediately in the process of farrowing or gathered up to 12 hours post-farrowing. Just as the farrowing house workers went through the rooms, they would gather placentas for us. They would go ahead and bag those up. They'd bag them by litter. They'd go and label them with the Sow ID, and they would drop them into a cooler with ice packs. Now those bags, those placentas, and those ice packs would sit in storage for up to 12 hours until we had a technician available who could then go to the farm, and by pulling out one placental sample at a time, identifying and isolating umbilical cords, we could then express serum, clot, blood out of those placental cords. And by identifying and collecting blood samples, clot samples, serum samples from anywhere from 4 to 8 cords per placenta, we would end up with a pooled sample that we felt represented the level of viremia in those pigs at birth without having to deal with the time constraints of gathering pre-suckle serum on a piglet-by-piglet basis. So with the technology or the concept of gathering placental umbilical cord serum, we went into a couple of these sow herds that we thought were giving us some issues and sampled. Our routine sample size was 30 litters or 30 placental samples. Umbilical cords from each of those 30 end up with 30 pooled blood samples, and we compared the results that we found when we did viremia, that did PCR testing on the 30 blood samples, compared to what we considered the gold standard, which was to actually individually draw pre-suckle blood samples out of piglets from within those same 30 litters. And we were pleasantly surprised initially that if you look on the bottom left-hand corner down here, if we classified a series, and in this case it was if we classified litters as positive or negative based on the level of viremia in the pooled placental blood, across these 20 litters that were considered positive by looking at the placental blood sample, 16 out of those 20 were likewise positive if we looked at individual piglets. Okay? By the same token, if we looked at the negative samples within this group, in this case we had 27 litters that were considered negative because the pooled sample did not have any evidence of circovirus. Out of those 24 that were negative, looking at the placental umbilical cord serum sample, 24 of those 27 were also negative by individual piglet testing. So with that level of agreement, we were confident that we could go on and continue to use the placental samples as a measure of whether that litter should be termed viremic or non-viremic in terms of porcine circovirus. We also found by testing different farms, and that when we went into our 30 head samples, we had some farms that had high levels of viremia. We had 70 to 80% of either individual litter piglet testing or umbilical cord serum testing. We had litters that were in the 70 to 80% positive, and the two values between the two sample collection methods agreed. We also had herds that had litters in the 10% positive range. And again, whether we used individual piglet serum samples or whether we used the umbilical cord serum samples, the values were very, very comparable. So again, we felt this was good validation that we could continue forward. Again, trying to get back to the first question, which is why are these pigs viremic at a young age? Well, we could use our umbilical cord serum samples as a method of gathering information. This was another example of a similar another case out of another group of farms. Again, simply to show that if we gathered, in this case, we had 17 sow farms. We had 17 litters that were classified as positive based on placental viremia, and out of those 17, 15 of those were also positive by having at least one pig within that litter viremia. So again, we have a good level of cross comparison between both positives and between negatives. With 4 negative litters, 3 of those 4 were also classified as negative by individual pig blood collection. So with what we felt was good validation of our technique, we looked at applying this technology to a larger group of sows, larger numbers. If you remember on one of the earlier slides where I showed the Cargill flow, we had those 6 sow farms within that pod that were fairly uniform as I described them from a management strategy. And they are very uniform. They are well managed. They're good producing herds. But the one issue that we had heard repeatedly from one of the farm managers was that he was struggling, or he felt he was struggling. When these 6 fellows got together for their monthly manager meeting, we had one fellow here who constantly complained, production isn't good. I'm doing everything I can compared to the other 5 cohorts, and I just can't get the level of production that they can. I'm only putting out 28.5 pigs per sow per year. I'm just really struggling. Okay? Most of us grin at 28.5 pigs per sow. His problem was his cohorts. As a group, these 6 farms within that unified pod we're bumping up close to 30 PSY. And this poor guy felt bad because he's only doing 28.5. So we got to thinking about it, wondering if this might be a circovirus related issue. We weren't specifically seeing the piglet problem, but it was on our radar. And so we went and started looking at the level of viremia within 30 head samples across each of these 6 farms. The one thing I'll make note of is that we didn't run in and do 130 head sample and say, we know what's going on in the world. This is an example of a single farm tested 3 different months. Well, for simplicity, we'll call this January, February, March. Tested 3 different months. On the first test, we had 30 samples, and the range for the positive samples was between 2.5 and 3.5 logs of virus per mil. Okay. The following month, it was up slightly. We're closer to between 3 and 4 logs of virus. The third month, we had dropped. We're down between 1.5 and 2.5 logs of virus. Still a positive herd, but there is some variation, and we just want to caution everyone about that over time, that there is variation over time. And so as we proceeded forward, again, along the lines of trying to get good numbers, we decided not to make any rash judgments, and we'd require at least 3 monthly testings before we'd start trying to classify these sow farms. So we added some time to our program. Back to our 6 sow farms. So we've got our 6 farms. We collected 3 sets of blood samples out of each of those farms. We collected a black month, a green month, and a purple month out of each of the farms, A, B, C, D, E, and F. And after testing each of these 6 farms 3 months in a row, what we discovered is that there is some consistency. Farms B, C, and D were consistently above 80% positive samples. In other words, for each of these bars is a monthly sample with at least 30 liters collected. To get 80% positive, you've got to have at least 24 of your 30 liters positive for circovirus. And again, this is blood taken from placental cord. We think it's a true representation of those pigs being born viremic. So on these 3 farms, what we have is 3 consecutive months for each of these 3 farms where they've got between 80 and 100% of their litters are born viremic. Now, the other 3 farms are bouncing down in the 20 to 50%. This farm crosses the 80% line once, but in general, we've got 3 farms that we consider low viremia and 3 farms with high viremia. So, with that in mind, then we go back to the question of does it matter? These are the same 6 farms, A, B, C, D, E, and F, and we had B, C, and D were the 3 farms that had the high levels of viremia. Now, just as a note to make sure everyone understands, these are good producing farms. The black bars here is the long-term conception rate across these farms, and they're all bumping. Let me get my numbers right. They're all bumping between basically running 98%, 99% conception rate. So certainly no duds in the bunch. But the thing we did notice was that our farms that had the high level of viremia, if we looked at their live-born pigs as a percentage of total born, these 3 farms fall short of the rest. Or looked at in another fashion, stillborns and mummies being the difference in live-born versus total-born. If we look at stillborns and mummies numerically, we have stillborns and mummies on these 3 farms, again, B, C, and D. These 3 farms are above the average compared to the other 3 farms, which are non-viremic. So we're starting to put some numbers together. And again, I say some numbers because we're only talking about 6 farms, okay? I wish it were 600. It's only 6. But we think we have something started here that is worth following up on. So if what we see is real, and if it's widespread, then the question becomes, can we impact that? If we're truly measuring the difference between stable sow farms and non-stable sow farms in terms of circovirus viremia in neonatal pigs, can we do something to impact that? We throw around the term biosecurity. Biosecurity, in most cases, is farrowing house practices, and it's not cross-fostering pigs, and it's cleaning afterwards. But in this case, we have viremic pigs at birth. Okay, so we've got to step back in the process before biosecurity, before cross-fostering. Something else needs to be used as the point of attack for an impact here. Herd closure was considered, gilt acclimation was considered, and potentially mass vaccination with circovirus. The history on these six sow farms within this unit is that as those gilts were initially produced as 10-pound wean pigs or 14-pound wean pigs, they all received a dose of circovirus vaccine. There was no additional circovirus vaccine given to any of those animals within that 6-pod system. So the opportunity to booster with another dose of vaccine along the line was certainly an option. So we looked at herd closure, potentially gilt acclimation, looked at vaccination again with the thought of, can we impact this level of viremia? So we took 4 of these 6 sow farms. The 3 up here, the red, the green, the black, were high-level, high viremia sow farms, the herds that routinely were kicking out between 25 and 30 positive litters a month. And we took one of our more moderate viremic litters, and we started at this point, and then started forward with a series of interventions. The first was the red farm, and after measuring viremia here and the subsequent month, we then loaded the farm with gilts, and then quit introducing gilts. So we had a big slug of gilts in, and then no more gilt introductions after that. The farm continued to farrow, their next monthly farrowing, the next monthly farrowing, nothing happened. We still have a high level of viremia. And then 60 to 70 days after the loading and the closure, no more gilts being introduced, our viremia level fell. And for 3 consecutive months, we've been on the downhill or near zero. So we've gone from 25 and 30 viremic litters on a monthly test to 1 or 2 out of 30. Probably related to the gilt closure. Another intervention that we looked at, well, I should say we did throw a control herd in here. This was one of our cohort herds that was up at the high level of viremia, and having done nothing, across these 7 months of testing, grabbing 30 litters at farrowing every month, we see very little change. Back to the intervention, we had the herd closure. We also opted for mass vaccination of the sow herd. We went in on one day, we vaccinated 2,500 sows. Some are due to farrow, some are in mid-gestation, some are gilts just recently bred or just recently moved into the herd, but we did a single mass vaccination. And what we saw there was this light green herd that had been bumping along the high viremia level after mass vaccination. We had a slight drop, an uptick, and we've been down for the next 2 months. One more intervention we did was a mass vaccination on another herd, and that was our moderate level, our moderate viremia herd. Again, we had some moderate collection months. We did a mass vaccination. Again, 1 dose of vaccine, 1 dose of Circoflex across the entire breeding herd. And I need to qualify this. 1 dose of mass vaccination, that single dose of Circoflex across the entire breeding herd, and to each of their gilts as they received them. So if we call this dark green herd a mass vaccination herd, that means the sow herd was vaccinated here, and then each week as they received bred gilts, they were also vaccinated. So we produced a mass vaccinated herd. The point here is, following mass vaccination, we continued a downtrend and then kept it in the low range, down or at that 20% viremic range. So in total, what we're seeing here is that, again, limited numbers, but what we're seeing is that the interventions, whether it was a herd closure to stop the introduction of mid-gestation gilts on a regular basis, or whether it was mass vaccination, the interventions coincided with a significant decrease in viremia for litters tested after that. So we think we're onto something at that point, and following the infection chain back, potentially one more step, because as I said, this pocket of sows that we're working with are all fed from a single gilt breeder unit. We wondered if there's something going on in that gilt development barn that could actually be causing destabilization through each of these 6 sow farms on a regular basis, producing these viremic pigs. So this is where we're at now. To try and answer the question of whether something is happening in the gilt developer barn, we have an inclination that there may have been something going on, and that's based on this herd where we did the gilt closure. If you remember, this herd had been running relatively high. We did a gilt closure, and then as those gilts got into farrowing, we had this decrease. And so we wonder if having very clean or very naive gilts in that gilt developer barn, entering a sow herd, particularly entering a sow herd in mid-gestation, so they have a limited opportunity for acclimation, that those naive gilts coming in the sow herd might actually be triggering viremia virus production and destabilizing a sow herd that might otherwise become stable. At least in this one opportunity, when we stopped placing gilts into the herd, we seem to be able to stabilize the herd. So our hypothesis then is that negative or naive gilts entering the herd may actually be the cause of instability. And we're working forward along those lines. So, some summary information. Certainly, circovirus disease is not a big issue in our circovirus vaccinated pigs. As I said earlier, and as Dr. Murtaugh referred to, circovirus vaccines work well. The grow-finish mortalities of 2006 are an issue of the past. What we're looking at is circovirus issues in much younger pigs, circovirus issues that may be related to vertical transmission, but certainly not consistent vertical transmission, because as we've seen, levels can vary within herds and between herds, anywhere from the 20 and 30% viremias to the 100% viremias, as measured on neonatal piglet samples. We also feel that placental umbilical cord sampling is a good method to test sow herds for stability. I didn't show didn't highlight the slide that was there as we went through here, but when we went into these 30 litters and we collected umbilical cord samples, and we discovered that we had 24, 25, or 28 of those samples positive, and then paired that with sow serum that was collected at the time of farrowing, our numbers with the sow samples were consistently lower than the percent or the ratio of positive samples we found with actual piglet testing. Sow samples were generally running half of what the piglet samples were. We certainly agree that circovirus is widely present in the environment. When we did our Swiffer samples, even in the sow herds that had low levels of viremia in the piglets, we still had high percentages of Swiffer positive or environmentally contaminated samples from out of these farrowing crates. As I said earlier, I do think that 3 sampling periods are necessary if you want to use the information from placental cord sampling as a way to classify a sow herd, because there is variation within a sow herd from month to month. We did find, out of the 3 of the 6 herds that had the highest umbilical cord sample viremia positive samples, we did find that even though conception rates are very similar across all 6 farms, the 3 herds that did have the highest viremia recordings also had fewer live-born pigs as a percentage, and that live-born obviously is due to a combination of both mummies and stillborns. And I would throw in a personal opinion here in that, knowing the management system within that cluster of 6 sow farms, I'm quite confident that this is not an error in recording or just a difference within farms. This is a real effect. Interventions. We talked briefly about interventions. We talked about herd closure. We talked about mass vaccination with Circoflex. It did coincide with herds that were then detected or classified as being circovirus stable. We certainly need more herds to do this on. We had a very small number, and I think repeatability of this would be important if it can be done. And finally, gilt development or surveillance of gilt grower farms before they feed these gilts into the sow farms is important. We currently have tests. We have viremia testing going on gilts entering this breeding farm. We have tests going on gilts exiting the breeding farm, and then there's also gilts that have left the breeding farm and entered sow farms. And we're trying to, again, everything takes time along a chain, but we're to the point where we're trying to follow these gilts after they've entered the sow farm to see if they truly could be the source of disruption or instability. Our beliefs, we're quite confident that circovirus vaccine will protect a pig from the time of vaccination on through marketing. Even with extended marketing, it works well. But we are still trying to tweak that early nursery phase to get optimum circovirus control. Again, knowing when these pigs are viremic, knowing that this is not litter to litter cross contamination, this truly is sow to piglet infection. We feel vertical transmission is obviously real. We do need additional work to determine the production and the economic impact. Okay, we have viremic piglets. We have some circovirus-related disease. We may have some reproductive disease, but we're still looking to gather numbers to show if this is a truly economic issue. The risk factors for unstable sow herds, it may be those gilts coming in without sufficient acclimation time. There may be other risk factors that we haven't identified to date. And finally, we plan to continue working on circovirus viremia at the gilt, the mature sow herd, and also the piglet level. So, circovirus testing in terms of the umbilical cord sampling process has gone from the step of one sow herd where we showed that it worked as well as individual piglet testing. We've gone to comparing sow herds. We've gone into a 6 sow pod, and we think we've collected information showing that the sampling method is real and it's revealing information that we think may be important in the future. The next step is obviously to expand this to a lot more sow farms, a lot more pigs, a lot more litters, and try and determine the risk factors associated with circovirus viremia and if there's an economic issue involved in all that.